Welcome back to another episode of Rock Boys Football. Shane Beamer, the South Carolina Gamecocks. They are not only one of the more talked about programs heading into 2025, they're one of the more fascinating programs as well. As, we come out of spring practice, as we wrap up the spring transfer portal window, you're seeing, a lot of different people in this space, you might say, come out with their power rankings in the SEC, coming out with their post spring top 25s, and you look at South Carolina and say they're all over the place in terms of how people are evaluating South Carolina going into the 2025 year. You'll see some that have South Carolina in the top 10. You'll see some that have South Carolina outside of the top 15. This is a polarizing football team, but where I'll start in the conversation I want to get into is this is a team that has massive upside. And I think what should excite South Carolina fans going into the 2025 years, that's, not always been something we've talked about with South Carolina over the last couple of years. Hey, how good are they going to be is a question. Did we ever consider South Carolina as a legitimate bona fide threat in the SEC? Did we ever see South Carolina as a legitimate bona fide threat to make a run in the college football playoffs? Not really. You kind of are saying that in 2025. Now, I happen to be, and I think many of y'all know this, I happen to be a Shane Beamer, Lenor Sellers believer going into 2025. If South Carolina maximizes this football team, is their best version of themselves in 2025, how good can South Carolina be? But I think more importantly, hey, what needs to happen for South Carolina going into the 2025 year? That's the conversation I want to get into. Before we get into it, as always, I want to give a massive shout out to the South Carolina fans. Many of y'all know it's been a blast for myself talking this program. Whether we're talking the portal, whether we're talking spring ball, the amount of support that y'all have shown the fellas over the last couple of months has been amazing. Can't thank you guys enough. If y'all do enjoy the content, consider subscribing to the channel. Without further ado, let's get into it. Now, number one, when we're having this conversation of, hey, South Carolina's most dangerous version, it starts with LaNorris Sellers. And now I think this is what excites South Carolina fans the most is two different things. One, the upside for LaNorris Sellers is legitimate Heisman Trophy winner, one of, if not the best players in college football. You can't say that for a lot of other quarterbacks across the country. There are a lot of good quarterbacks in the country, but you're not saying, hey, they're going to win the Heisman Trophy or they're going to go out and be a top 10 NFL draft pick. You can legitimately have that conversation with LaNorris Sellers because there aren't a lot of athletic profiles looking like LaNorris Sellers in terms of what he can do as an athlete, in terms of what he can do pushing the ball down the field. Now, this is what excites me about LaNorris Sellers. The kid is getting better at football, which, again, you look across the country, look at a guy like Carson Beck, maybe look at a guy like Garrett Nussmeier at LSU, some of the consensus better quarterbacks that we see in the country. This is not a shot at either of them, by the way. I've been very vocal. I'm a big fan of Carson Beck, big fan of Garrett Nussmeier. How much better are they going to be in 2025 is probably a legitimate question. Guys that are going into their fifth, I think in Carson Beck's instance, 6-year senior. LaNorris Sellers is only getting better at the sport. I think in the first half of the 2024 year, even the more optimistic South Carolina fans probably had their question marks in terms of, is he the guy? And then he kind of turns the corner. And the back half of 2024, specifically in the month of November, you saw the switch flip and you saw the flashes of a difference maker at the quarterback position. And so you have a quarterback that, it's not just me getting up here and saying, it's what the odds markets are telling us too. LaNorris Sellers, anywhere you look, any sports book you fancy, top 8 Heisman odds going into 2025. You have a difference maker at quarterback, which allows South Carolina to access a ceiling that not a lot of other programs can access going into the 2025 year. Now, the second thing that excites me is you could argue, in fact, I would make the argument that it's going to be a better supporting cast around LaNorris Sellers. To me, it starts with the pass catchers. Look, the pass catchers are going to get better for South Carolina just purely on development. And you have Nick Harbor going into year 3, just focusing on football. Like, newsflash, Nick Harbor ain't going to get worse at football as he dedicates his all his time to this sport, which is probably the first time he's done that in his whole athletic career. Look at Mazeo Bennett going into year two. He's only going to get better going into year two. You inject a ton of talent from true freshmen coming in. And look, that wide receiver position, we saw it across the country last year, whether it was in the SEC, the Big Ten, the ACC, we saw difference makers at the wide receiver position as true freshmen. There are a couple of names that we see on the screen that could be those kind of dudes for South Carolina in 2025. It's by far the most talented crop of wide receivers that Shane Beamer has had coming into the program. The big question, like when you talk about South Carolina, what's it look like for this team to be a 10-win team making the college football playoffs? Michael Smith at tight end is arguably one of the most important players on this football team. You look at all the value that Joshua Simon brought to South Carolina. I mean, they were almost exclusively at certain points running their passing attack through the tight end position. Now, I don't think you're going to have to rely on the tight end position as much because I expect the wide receivers to be better. Make no mistake about it. Lenor Sellers is still going to be looking to Michael Smith. And look, the sky's the limit on this kid. You know, kind of unfortunate that he didn't get to participate in spring practice. We all remember what we were hearing out of him at fall camp last year. And if it probably wasn't for Joshua Simon really emerging as one of the better tight ends in the sport, you probably would have saw more from Mike Smith as a true freshman. What does he look like as a sophomore? Can he be a all-conference caliber tight end? Big time thing that probably needs to happen if South Carolina reaches their potential. Offensive line, it's going to be better. You know, Josiah Thompson and Casey Henry were only getting better at the back half of 2024. Like, there's a good chance Josiah Thompson, a left tackle, who, look, he was not good for most of the season last year until the last couple of weeks. He was really dang good. You could get all conference performance from Josiah Thompson. You could get an all conference performance from a guy like Trebab Balede at guard. They hit on Boaz Stanley at the center position. At least that's what we heard coming out of spring. I look at this offensive line and say, yeah, I guess you're not totally sure what it's going to look like, but you kind of have some blind confidence that this is the deepest and most talented this offensive line has been under Shane Beamer. If South Carolina goes out and wins 9-10 football games, the offensive line is not only solid, I would expect this offensive line to be towards the top end of the SEC in the 2025 year. And I don't think that's crazy to say because Shane Beamer's done a really good job getting blue chip talent to this position and supplementing through the transfer portal. Then the big X factor here, Rasul Faison. From what we heard from this kid out of spring is that he is a 1-for-1 replacement for Rocket Sanders, potentially a better running back than Rocket Sanders. Now, we're waiting for the news from the NCAA in terms of eligibility. At least that's the last time I checked. You get Rasul Faison eligible, which I think is the expectation. You might be better at running back too. And so we're talking about LaNorris Sellers getting better, which should be the expectation. I don't see how he gets any worse. We're talking about the running game being better because you got a good running back and you got a better offensive line. Talking about the pass catchers getting better around LaNorris Sellers. This was a solid offense in the back half of 2024. There's reason to believe it gets better into the 2025 year. Now, here's the big question mark. You know, does the defense – I don't think a lot of South Carolina fans are expecting the same kind of defense that we saw in 2024. You know, but I think the expectation should be it still. Look, if South Carolina is winning 10-plus games, the defense is still solid. The defense is still a top-end unit in the SEC. Now, it was one of the best units in the country last year. Can it still be in the top 30 this year is probably the question. One thing you feel really good about is the secondary can deal with anybody in the SEC, which, look, that's important. You look at, you want to win big-time football games against some of the best teams in this conference. You got to make sure you have a secondary that can hold up. And I think South Carolina has that. The last thing is, what's the defensive line look like? And there's three things that need to happen here. Number one, you got to stay healthy. And I want to pull up South Carolina's schedule because there was something that I wanted to talk about the schedule too, and I didn't pull it up. So we're going to pull up the South Carolina schedule as well. But getting back to the defensive line, because I think that conversation is pretty important here. Number one, you probably have to stay healthy. Yeah, I think that's probably the biggest concern for a lot of South Carolina fans is like, look, if we get banged up here, do we trust our 2 and 3 deep? Number two, you got to hit on your portal additions. Troy Pikes, Brownlaw Dindy, a guy like Xavier Hardy coming from JUCO, Devontae Miles. They all need to be guys that you feel comfortable playing. And you also have to hit on development. Like, does Dylan Stewart take a step and become the best pass rusher in the country in 2025? What does Desmond you look like going into year 3 of his career? There are some guys on this roster that, could take that step. So you got to hit on your portal guys. You got to hit on the development, and you probably got to stay healthy. If those three things happen, again, I don't think we'll expect that defensive line to be as dominant as it was in the 2024 year because that was one of the best units in the country. But if you hold serve and you're solid, the offense will pick up the slack. And then here's the last thing that I kind of wanted to talk about here was the opportunity for momentum with South Carolina. Why I think this is so important is we saw what this team looked like with momentum in the back half of 2024. We saw a South Carolina team that shaky start to start the 2024 year. When they got that thing rolling going into the month of November, they were a freight train, and you better get off the track or you're going to get run over. Can South Carolina get the train rolling early in the season? They have the opportunity to. You play Virginia Tech neutral site on a Sunday. Fire me up for that game because that's a game South Carolina, if they're as good as I think they will be, should win that game. But it ain't going to be a cakewalk. Virginia Tech's a very solid ACC program. So you get the opportunity to get a win on a national stage with a lot of eyeballs on you against the team you probably should beat. South Carolina State should be a win. You get Vanderbilt at home. That should be a win. Now, Vanderbilt's a little bit more of a tricky team than they used to be. Still should be a win. You go on the road to play Missouri, which is probably the only game where you won't be a touchdown plus favorite. I got question marks about the Missouri Tigers going into the 2025 year. They got to replace the quarterback. They got to replace their best wide receiver. Now, I'm not saying they're going to be a bad team. I just don't know if they'll be the team that we saw the last 2 years. And then you get Kentucky at home. Now, it gets harder after that, but you're going through the month of September with a very real chance to start out 5-0 going off to your bye week. It's a confident South Carolina team. And look, they'll need all the confidence in the world because they go on the road to play LSU. They get Oklahoma at home. They get Alabama at home. Then you go on the road to Ole Miss. There's a very real chance that we're going into the month of November with maybe one loss on the road to LSU. And again, I think South Carolina has a chance to beat anybody in the country. I'm excited because I think there are a lot of reasons to believe in South Carolina going into 2025. They also have the schedule that's going to give them the opportunity to get the ball rolling and get confident as a football team. That's what excites me the most. Appreciate you guys rocking with it. Please let it fly in the comment section in terms of expectations. Am I too high on this football team? Because I'm starting to buy my stock. Appreciate you guys, and we'll talk to y'all later. Peace.